Hi, and welcome to episode number 9 of the N1 Analytics Podcast. I'm your host, Alex West, and today we begin a two-part exploration of the history of the NBA, the things that made it what it is today. We have special guest Mike West on the show. He's going to be with us today. He's going to be with us Thursday. We're going to do about half of it today, and the other half's going to come out on Thursday. So stay tuned, and Brent, take us away. Special guest on the podcast today, Mike West. My dad, he's going to do a little basketball history with us. So, Dad, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Well, thanks for having me on.
Yep, you gotta keep your podcast lineup fresh, and so that's what I'm trying to do. So
there you go.
Before we get into the history, before we dive into the depths of how basketball has changed through the years, let's talk about games 1 and 2 of the finals. What are your takeaways early on from games 1 and 2?
Well, as you and I have discussed before, I'm more of a casual observer of the game than you and even Chaz for that matter. But my observations are that the Warriors built a team to beat LeBron James, and right now they're having a lot of success doing it because they shoot the ball extremely well. And as you and I were talking about a minute ago, they shoot off the dribble. Their threes are not from the corner, as you know we're going to talk about later. That was the first development in the three-point shot. But they shoot from the top of the key. They shoot from the parking lot.
They only took 5 corner threes last night.
Right.
They went 2 for 5 on corner threes, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, and they create they screen, get that shot off the dribble, and they also if you make a mistake in transition, they kind of remind me. I don't know if you've told your listeners, but I'm a football guy. They kind of remind me of those old Florida State teams in the 90s. If you lay the ball on the ground, if you turn the ball over, they're going to convert. So you can't make a mistake against them, and you got to figure out how to stop their shots. And right now, the Warriors are doing pretty much what they want to.
Has Kevin Durant impressed you? I mean, obviously he's been impressive, but beyond what you normally know about Kevin Durant, has he just been more impressive to you with his 38, 8 in Game 1, and then last night with 33, 13, and 6? Just impressive numbers across the board.
Well, the numbers are impressive, but what's impressive is the way he stepped up. There were a lot of people who didn't like the fact that he left to go to Golden State to win a championship. But once he got there, he was sort of the guy with the most pressure on him, in my opinion, because they brought him in to win. And if he didn't win, it was going to reflect bad on his legacy. But as you and I talked a little while ago, LeBron is it's kind of a win-win situation. If he wins this against Golden State, he's fantastic. If he loses, they had to build a mega team to beat him, and this mega team's the centerpiece of that mega team's Kevin Durant, and he's really responded.
Yeah, he's played really well, and I think that if the Cavaliers come back and win this, I put this in my piece on Thursday, and I stand by this, that if the Cavaliers were to win this series, LeBron James vaults himself. Maybe vault's the wrong word because it's not like it's a very far reach, but he enters into the Jordan conversation, the who's the best ever. And I feel like a loss is just not that big a deal for him. I mean, it's going to hurt legacy-wise. People are going to say 3-5, which is fair, but I don't feel like there's too much damage to your legacy taking a loss unless you get swept.
Right, and even if he gets swept, you still had to create this team to beat him. Hey, the Golden State Warriors built this team to beat LeBron James, not the Cavaliers. So, I mean, yeah, it can hurt his legacy, but you're absolutely right. If he wins this one, you have to put him strongly in the conversation of greatest of all time, simply for the fact that I always go back to the first team he took to the finals. That first team he took to the finals was awful.
They were awful, the 06-07.
And I know it's blasphemy to say this here in North Carolina, but Jordan never took a team like that to the finals.
Yeah.
And that always plays into my discussion of the greatest of all time. And I don't want to get into that because as I study basketball, it's hard to compare eras, but certainly that's got to be thought of in the conversation. And last year he beat a pretty good Golden State team in the finals. This year it doesn't look good for him right now, but if he does somehow win this thing, you've got to consider him right there with Jordan, in my opinion.
I think it's unbelievable. I'm just looking at the roster of that 06-07 team. Yeah. LeBron was their leading scorer. He scored 27 a game. Their next three leading scorers were Larry Hughes, Zerundas Ilgauskas, and Drew Gooden. That team went to the finals. A team with Larry Hughes, Zerundas Ilgauskas, Drew Gooden as your second, third, and fourth best players.
Right, exactly.
Jeff Van Gundy always says that the 07 team should be counted towards LeBron's legacy instead of against it. I tend to agree. What an awful, awful team.
But LeBron, I mean, it's to me definitely the best player playing in right now, and it's kind of hard to compare eras. But I think LeBron's talent would transcend any era. I think he would be able to play in any era. Jordan would have been able to play, for that matter, Russell and Chamberlain, and we'll get into the discussion about them a little later. But it's hard to compare. But I certainly, if I was starting a team right now, even at his age, I'd probably still start it with LeBron.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue. And possibly I think the other side of the argument is last two podcasts ago, Matthew and I discussed who we would take if there was a redraft, but I think Kevin Durant has sort of injected his name into that discussion with his defensive play in particular. I mean, he's been stellar on offense, but his defensive play, the block he had on Kyrie last night where he came from behind, right. He had a couple blocks. He blocked Love at the rim in the fourth quarter. Like, he has played spectacularly at both ends of the ball.
His block of Kyrie Irving's shot from behind was reminiscent of LeBron James last year in Game 7 when he made that block from behind. So I think Durant's putting himself in that position as LeBron ages, if LeBron's aging, because he seems to have this incredible regrowth of his physical skills this year. But if he is aging, I think Durant's putting himself in line to take the throne, so to speak, when LeBron slows down.
I think that's definitely true. There's one more thing before we move on to what we are talking about today. What are your thoughts? I have this theory that Kevin Love and Tristan Thompson can't play together because they can't defend a pick and roll well enough. What are your thoughts on Cleveland not being able to play, or in my estimation, do you agree with that assessment? Do you think that they can play two bigs against this small lineup, or do you think that they have to sort of get caught up in Golden State's game and play the way Golden State plays?
I think Golden State forces you to play the way they want you to play. You might be right. I don't know that you can slow a team that plays in transition and shoots long threes down with two bigs. I don't think it's worked so far. If I were Tyronn Lue, I'd be willing to try anything at this point because it's been frustrating. I mean, there were stretches where the Cavs played pretty well in both of those games and still really couldn't put a dent in the armor. So if I were Tyronn Lue, I'd be looking at a lot of different options. I may go small. I may go try to match them up. He's tried to slow the game down, and it stretches. That's worked. But all in all, it didn't work that well. So what do you do to stop what do you do? I don't know. Maybe you play their game.
Well, Cleveland's best lineup last night, they starting at 9:56 to go in the third quarter. The score's 47-35. Golden State's up. They play a lineup for 7 minutes, almost 7 minutes. The same lineup from 9:56 to 3:06. It's LeBron, Kyrie, Kevin Love, Kyle Korver, and Iman Shumpert. And in that stretch, they really slow the game down. They play the same five guys, and they really lock down on defense. And a lot of their shots come after right around the 11-second mark in the shot clock. And I think there's two parts of that are really important. I think slowing down the shot clock and then putting together a lineup. It's very odd to say that Kyrie Irving and Kevin Love are going to be involved in a defensive lineup, but they put together a defensive lineup. They used Iman Shumpert on Durant a lot during that. But I think that's their best bet going forward is to be really slow on the shot clock, take their time, play LeBron bully ball, and probably play with one big.
Well, you might be the first basketball analyst to ever use Kevin Love, Kyrie Irving, and defense in the same set.
And Kyle Korver on top of it.
There you go.
Cleveland just does not have any good perimeter defenders. They should have traded for Tucker instead of Korver, but whatever. All right, so Do you think Cleveland takes Game 3?
I think when it goes back to Cleveland, LeBron's in a bad mood. I'm sure those first two games weren't to his liking, and I look for him to take Game 3, but I don't really know if this series. I originally predicted the Cavs, but watching this, I don't know if this goes past 5 games.
Yeah, it is not looking good at the moment. I don't love Tyronn Lue in that spot for that reason. I don't know how many adjustments Tyronn Lue is ready to make, and I think they need a lot of adjustments in a very short period.
Right.
Anyway, let's go on from the NBA Finals, and let's talk about a lot of people have been asking me to do a podcast that sort of focused on the history of basketball, a little bit about rule changes, about X's and O's, about the factors that brought the game from where it was to where it is. And so that's sort of what we're going to get into today. And that's why I brought my dad in, because he's a historian of sorts, a little bit more of a regular historian than a basketball historian, but somebody with perspective on.
Well, I think to your point, I think what we need to, the way to approach this is to talk about the players that created the rule changes through the eras, and then what the effect of those rule changes were. But you can't really talk about the game without giving a little bit of history. Dr. Naismith, we all know that story, 1891, cold in Massachusetts. He needs an indoor activity, so he creates this game called where he puts 2 peach baskets at the end of an arena, of a indoor arena, so to speak. And
it's a volleyball court, right?
Volleyball court, yeah. And he puts a peach basket at each end. And I understand from looking from a couple sources that the first time he tried it was in a PE class, and there were 50 players on the court. So,
well, there you go.
So that game didn't work too well. It was a very slow game. You had to get the ball out of the peach basket after every point. I don't know why they didn't cut the bottom out of the basket. But anyway, it was a very slow game. But the next year he had 18 players in his class, and they cut it down. They finally decided on 5 players on a side, and that seemed to be perfect for the size court they had. But he went on to take this game to YMCAs in the summer when he wasn't a professor. He was also going on mission trips, and he took the game around the world. So the game grew really rapidly. But he settled at the University of Kansas and was at the University of Kansas for almost 40 years as a professor. And that's part of the reason I think why Kansas has such a basketball legacy. They can look back to where it all started. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, those are just background things. The pro game didn't really take off. There was some attempts in the 30s, 20s, and 30s to have leagues, but they didn't pay their bills because nobody came to watch them. And so they all folded. There were some barnstorming teams. Your team and mine, the Celtics, wasn't the Boston Celtics, but one of the original pro teams was the original Celtics of New York,
okay,
and the Harlem Globetrotters. And they used to barnstorm the country and play college teams, high school teams, pickup teams, whatever. It was like the old barnstorming.
Oh, I was going to say like the baseball, the way they used to do baseball.
Right, the old baseball barnstorming in the 30s. But in 1937, there was the first pro league came into existence. It was called the National Basketball League. And very curiously enough, it was sponsored by corporations, which seems to be the way the NBA is heading again.
So it only took them 70 years to figure out that was a good model, huh?
Right. GE, Firestone, and Goodyear sponsored this league, mostly in the Midwest.
Oh, that's funny. The GE just signed to be an on-jersey sponsor next year for the Celtics. So,
right.
So still doing it.
Returning to their roots, kind of.
Yep.
The first teams out there were, Fort Wayne and Oshkosh and Sheboygan and Rochester, Minnesota. It's a Midwest league. Most of the teams were named after car parts. For example, the Fort Wayne Zollner Pistons.
Right.
A Zollner piston was an improvement. I'm not a mechanic, but it was a new kind of piston. He paid to have his team had the Fort Wayne team called the Zollner Pistons. But anyway, games were played in taverns, in armories, in dance halls, even high school gyms. There was really no home. They traveled everywhere. It was more or less a barnstorming kind of league. If the arena was filled up, you went to a tavern and played. So it was kind of an interesting concept. But one of the first players that influenced the game actually was in that National Basketball League.
Okay.
Was a guy named Leroy Cowboy Edwards.
Okay.
He was a big guy, and what he'd do is he'd stand in the middle of the lane and he'd hold his hand up and catch the ball and score. So to stop that, the league developed a 3-second rule, which we all know and understand. That came about as a result of a big man who just stood in the lane and was taller than everybody and put his hands up. So that's one of the first that was later carried over to the NBA, and so that's one of the first rule changes that was created by a situation. I think the NBA's been more fluid than other leagues and quicker to respond. When something slows the game down or clogs the game up, the NBA makes some changes, and usually they're pretty substantial.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the 3-second rule had a profound effect. He at least had to get out of the lane once in a while and go back in.
For frame of reference, Leroy Cowboy Edwards was a colossal 6'5", 210-pound man.
Giant of a man.
Giant of a man.
But today would be a small guard.
Yeah.
Be a two guard.
Be a two guard. Anyway,
in 47, George Meekin came into the league. He was the first big star, but he played for the Chicago American Gears, who won the NBL championship. And then the owner decided to withdraw from the league, and he folded his team and formed his own league. Meekin decided to stay in the NBL. He signed with the Minnesota Lakers, who later became an NBA team. So you had some of those teams that carried over. The Rochester Royals became the Kings. The Pistons became the Detroit Pistons later. Tri-City Blackhawks are now the Atlanta Hawks. The Syracuse Nationals, as we all know, became the 76ers. But Meekin carried on that big man tradition. Meekin was 6'10". Meekin really was a giant.
Yeah, he really was a big fella.
He was a giant. Today he'd even be a power forward, maybe a center, but I know power forward kind of dates me. I think you number players now, but he's a
nobody says power forward anymore, Dad. Everybody's a 4. They're a 3 or a 4 or a 5.
Okay, well, anyway, he would have been even in today's game. He was a big man, but at that time he was huge. The big man domination in that era, slow, deliberate play, run isolations, get the ball to the big man and let him score. But I will tell you, the average team score in that league was 67.8 points.
Okay. And that was that in a 40-minute game? You might not know right off the top of your head, but
I think it was a 40-minute game. I think when the NBA became a league, they went to 48 minutes. Yeah. But you still had a 67-point scoring.
It's still much lower, even per minute.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But some things came out of that league that changed the game, I think, forever. One of them was they were losing fans because nobody wants to watch a 25-24 game. So they implemented the shot clock.
Okay.
24 seconds. The guy who invented it was an owner of one of the teams, and he'd watched games. He actually did what we call now analytics and figured out that if you fired a shot off every 24 seconds, you could up the scoring by X percentage. I don't have the formula he used, but he actually went through and said if we increase the shot to 24 seconds, we'll increase the points, we'll increase the fans, we'll increase the money. So that was his formula that he took to the owners, and they implemented the shot clock. The other big transition was in 1947, the National Basketball League made zone defenses illegal.
Which stayed for a long time.
Right. When you have a big man like George Meekin and you put him in the middle of the floor, you and I know and your listeners know from watching high school games, if you have a kid that's 6'7", 6'8" in a high school game, you can dominate the game.
Yep.
And with a zone defense. And so that was one of the big changes that came out of that league was the shot clock, the implementation of the shot clock, and one more thing was a foul limit.
Okay.
Team foul limit. Now after a certain number of fouls, you're penalized. Well, prior to this change, it was just 2 shots for a foul, or a 1-and-1 for a foul, and that was it. There were no limits. There were no penalties for committing as many fouls as you can. In fact, in the 40s, the average foul was about 80 fouls a game. So 80 foul shots a game. I'm sorry, 80 foul shots a game, which is a lot of foul shots.
For frame of reference on that one, I think last night there were 43 foul shots taken.
Right, and it seemingly as a casual observer, 43 is kind of a lot for an NBA game.
It did feel like a lot,
right,
particularly at times, but 80 seems to double that seems a lot higher.
Right, and of course, one of the first things they did away with that I didn't mention, and this I don't know that it did have a tremendous impact on the game. You and your listeners may or may not know that at the beginning of a league, at the beginning of this professional league, you had a jump ball after every basket scored.
I did not know that.
So that was done away with. That was what basketball was, college basketball, YMCA basketball. Every time there was a basket scored, you went and had a jump off at half court or at the foul line. I'm not sure which one, but there was after every basket there was a jump ball.
Wow.
So you can see between that and 80 fouls a game and a 6-foot lane, how big men dominated the game.
And it would take forever to play a game.
Right, and so you wound up with, and you also wound up with scores like 24-23. Matter of fact, the 1950 game a little bit later, but Fort Wayne was in a 19-18 game. That was at the end of that era.
That was,
but anyway.
That was, I think, the watershed moment for the shot clock when Danny Biasone, the Syracuse Nationals owner, decided that they needed the shot clock.
There you go. Well, there was another league called the Basketball Association of America, and it brought some teams together with the NBL. And then by 1949, you had what we now consider today's NBA.
Mm-hmm.
Meekin carried over. I think he won 5 of the first 6 titles in the NBA. His team did. One of the first things the NBA did, though, was 1952. They widened the lane from 6 feet to 12 feet.
The lane used to be keyhole shaped. They called it a keyhole lane.
That's where the old time when I was in school, which was a long time ago, we called that the top of the key. So it's still that phrase still carries over. But if you looked at it, it was actually a very narrow lane with a big circle. It looked like the old key in a hotel room door or something.
Yeah.
But it was 6 feet, and you can also see how that lane, being 6 feet, played into somebody like George Meekin's style. He was able to dominate the lane. But when the lane widened to 12 feet, guards were able to get into the lane. It brought the smaller guy into the ball game for the first time, really.
Yeah.
Before that, the guards and the 2s, 3s, 4s, 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s were actually just role players to get the ball to 5 so he could score. But I think the game's changed a lot just because of widening the lane. You were able to get guards into the lane, and you wound up with kids playing basketball later, like Oscar Robertson, who could get into the lane.
Yeah.
And that changed the game. But that widening the lane to 12 feet was a boost for guards. And you could see the results of the shot clock, of the widening the lane, of all these things. Scoring started to go up through the early and mid-50s a lot.
Okay.
But, and I don't know if this is the right time in the conversation to talk about it, but I think one of the biggest things that happened in the 50s was integration.
Right. Well, this is one of the big parts of the game where the game really took on new life, was in integration.
Right. And there's a quote from Bill Russell, and I don't remember the cities that he said. I'm sorry, from Wilt Chamberlain, where he said, if I had grown up in this city, I might be a football player. If I had grown up in this city, I might be a baseball player. He thought he could be an athlete in any sport.
And he was a 4-letter athlete, right? I mean, he did a bunch of stuff at Kansas.
But he thought he could excel in any sport. But he said, because I grew up in Philly, I was a basketball player. Yeah. Now, you and I talked a little bit about this before, not on the air, but you and I having discussions. Basketball was really the first game that welcomed African-American players, and it made a tremendous difference in the popularity of the game. Kids that grew up in the inner city, and a majority of them being African-Americans, there wasn't room on every street corner for a baseball field like we have here in western North Carolina, or room for a football field. But you could put a basketball court on the corner. So when a kid went out after school to play something, he played basketball.
Yeah.
So people's talents improved because of their access to the game.
And a lot of guys in the
Right.
particularly in the early and mid '60s, guys like Earl Monroe, who grew up in Winston Salem, or Wilt,
Right.
who grew up in Philadelphia.
Right.
Bunch of guys did grow up in inner city, and so you start to see that effect of inner city kids, particularly African American kids, coming into the game, and how much of an effect that had going forward.
And you had three players drafted in 1950, Clark Cooper, Nat Clifton, and Earl Lloyd, who were all African Americans. And what I think, though, changed the game in that regard as far as integration was when Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain and Oscar Robertson and Elgin Baylor came in the league later and were stars. They were athletes. They played the game differently than it had been played before. For example, Russell had much more of a team concept. Russell blocked shots. He threw passes. He did a lot of other things that big men in the previous era didn't do.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that if they kept assists, that Meekin probably didn't register too many of them.
Right.
But Russell was the first really big man that kind of transitioned to let me do things other than just score.
Right.
And matter of fact, Russell did score, and he scored a lot, but Russell was kind of responsible for a rule change too. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this. He used to do what they called funneling the ball into the basket.
This is how they got the offensive goaltending rule.
It's how offensive goaltending came about, because he'd catch the ball off the rim and just pop it down and score. And people said, well, that's an advantage we can't overcome because of Russell's athletic ability. He was able to get above everybody and drop it down. Also in that era, they outlawed throwing the ball over the backboard because the Sixers would just throw the ball out of bounds over top of the backboard, and Chamberlain would jump up and grab it and score.
Yeah.
So a couple of rule changes because of the size and athleticism of those guys that came in. But Russell and Chamberlain and Robertson and Elgin Baylor also started the NBA on TV. As we said a little while ago, before it was an ugly, low-scoring game. When you started having this influx of athletes, plus the popularity of basketball in the Northeast had finally taken hold, the Midwest League of the NBL spread toward the Northeast, and Boston and New York and places like that became NBA cities for real, and that made the sport a lot more popular. So there was a demand to put it on TV, but it didn't really get popular on TV until the Russell Chamberlain era. And smartly enough, the NBA seemed like scheduled the Lakers and the Celtics every Sunday afternoon so the nation could watch. And that's, so TV started to grow in that era. And I think also you had maybe a little different viewing audience than you would have had you not had integration. If integration hadn't been so successful in the NBA, you wouldn't have had that TV audience that you may have, where folks could gather and watch Russell and Chamberlain play. I think there was some additions that may not have watched the NBA had it remained like George Meekin played it.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. During the 60s, there's also a lot of other things, sort of from an X's and O's side, that there was a lot of volume scoring. They shot a lot of shots. For example, the Boston Celtics led the league in the 64-65 season with 123 possessions per game, which is, for comparison, the highest possessions per game this season was 101. So you're talking about a very elevated 20 more possessions per game, but the scoring doesn't go up. They really were just about volume shooting. Just come down, shoot a shot as quickly as possible, miss it, hit it, doesn't matter. So instead of efficiency, they sort of went for the opposite approach in the 60s was, we're going to shoot a lot, and some of them might go in.
Well, it's almost, to take it into the retail world, it's almost the Walmart approach.
Mm-hmm.
They you get a lot of shots at a lower price and score as many points. So, yeah, you're right. The philosophy then was let's shoot more times a game than our opponent does. The more shots we put up, the more go in. That was kind of the 60s Celtics had a whole lot of success with that. That was, as you said, that was their game plan, and the numbers bear that out. We're going to outshoot everybody. And those two rule changes in the 50s, had they not occurred, that wouldn't have been possible. The 24-second clock and things like that. That made that kind of style of play possible.
The early run and gun. The
Right.
Celtics also had some personnel that made that possible as well. We talked about Cousy and the ability to get into the lane, but guys like Bob Cousy, guys like Sam Jones, Casey Jones, and on those early Celtics teams, they had a number of skilled guards.
Absolutely. Cousy was, and you hear the old timers, and by old timers, I mean people older than me, because y'all probably call me an old timer, but I mean people older than me. They said Bob Cousy invented the pass. And I'm doing air quotes here, invented the pass.
Okay.
He was the first guy who really, really, really understood how to make the entrance pass into the lane.
And how to use a pass to get other guys open.
Right. And I think so the 60s was just a run and gun era. And I think you later saw that reflected in the 70s and 80s in college basketball as the folks who came out of the NBA got into coaching, got into being athletic directors. They started looking for that kind of scoring. So that the NCAA sort of went through that renaissance in the 70s and 80s after the NBA done it in the 60s.
Okay. So moving on from the 60s, what's the next big iteration in the game that changed?
Well, you had a couple of things. Interesting little story. I don't know if you ever heard this or not. It was a 63 All-Star game, I'm pretty sure. ABC was going to carry it live nationwide.
Yeah.
2 hours before the game, the players approached the commissioner of the league and said, if we don't have a pension agreement by the time this game starts, we're not playing. ABC then got into the mix and said, Mr. Commissioner, if we don't have a game, then the contract for NBA coverage for the rest of the season and any season going forward is void. So that was the first collective bargaining agreement. Now that's not an X or an O, and that's not a team concept, but that's a huge concept moving forward. That was the first pro sport to successfully, on the spot, collectively bargain.
I think the story goes behind that was that Russell and Wilt had been talking about it beforehand, and they were instrumental with some of the other guys in getting that done. But that Russell and Wilt sort of had this idea, and then going forward, they put it out to everybody else, and they were like, well, let's just do this right now, since they had all the most influential players in the league in the same room.
Right, and so that sort of changed the pricing strategy. A lot of the NBA, I think there's one more thing that we should probably mention here, and I think this plays into it. A lot of your best athletes didn't play in the NBA. As you know, baseball and the NFL even were more popular in the 50s than basketball was. And part of the reason they didn't play was because it didn't pay anything. There was a lot more money in baseball than there was in basketball.
Right.
So, and as I've been in discussions before with people about why America doesn't play soccer, and that's one of them, is that the best athletes in America, no offense to soccer players, but the best athletes in America don't play soccer. They play basketball and football now. And I think that's kind of the same thing that basketball went through, was a time when the best athletes went to other sports. Well, that collective bargaining agreement sort of started to turn that wheel. And as we said earlier, with the success of integration in the NBA, you then had some of the better African-American athletes start turning their attention toward basketball instead of the other sports, which I think helped build the game even more.
Yeah.
I think that's but when you take all those factors together, then you add that collective bargaining, that began to turn the table on player salaries, and that got some better people looking at the game.
Okay.
So 60s was when basketball became really popular on TV. They even showed some Thursday night games. See, TNT thought that idea up, but they didn't. It was already going on in the 60s. There was weekend basketball. That carried over into the 70s, which we'll talk about in a little while. But I remember watching the NBA on CBS every Sunday. My brother and I would watch the Celtics, and that was in the 70s, in the early 70s. So that tradition carried on for a good 20 years before cable TV came along, which also exponentially grew basketball.
Right. That's a late 80s iteration of
right.
basketball.
So, but I think that story about the 60s, collective bargaining, between that, the opening of the game, I mean, the game became a fast-paced, athletic-based game because of the rule changes, because of the philosophy of shot volume, which I think, you'll see later that analytics kind of turned the corner and went in the 80s, went back to thinking about the kind of shots they took. Well, that wasn't a concern in the 60s. You just go down there and fire it up.
Shoot more. Just more. That's all you needed. You just need to shoot one more time than the other team.
Right. So, your
that's Steve Spurrier.
There you go. Yeah, there you go.
We just need the ball one more time.
Right. And that's what the NBA thought. If we're basically going to shoot about the same as they are, so let's get more shots in.
Let's have the ball last.
I did not realize that the possessions were that high, and that's the kind of stuff analytics teaches you. But I always intuitively knew that the NBA scored more in the 60s. But when you talk about those the differential between now and then in possessions, that's amazing.
Yeah, 20 more possessions per team per game, so 40 possessions more across.
So you figure 15 more shots per team per game.
Yeah, that's unbelievable.
Yeah. All right. So as you get into the 60s, the other thing that happened was the ABA.
Okay.
And I know we're not here to talk about the ABA, but the ABA was even more shot volume, high-flying, wide-open game than the NBA was.
Mm-hmm.
And you had some teams come out of the ABA who later became NBA teams, but you had players that, Dr. J played in the NBA, and we all know what Dr. J's NBA career was like, but he started in the ABA, and I remember a lot of basketball purists in the 70s that just loathed the ABA. Oh, they're ruining the game. It's really just an extension of what the NBA was doing. The NBA on steroids, so to speak. But the game was so high-flying, so fast-paced that it began to become a threat to the NBA's hegemony of TV and everything else. So the NBA took moves to merge.
Okay.
There were a lot of issues. Spencer Hayward was a free agent, and that was sort of when basketball free agency began too. They had I'm trying to think what the contract's called. They had basically had a contract. They owned basketball players, and when the ABA merged, he didn't want to play on the team. He filed against the NBA's collective bargaining agreement and won the right to sign anywhere. Kind of opened the door to free agency. That might be another small turn in the game.
Okay.
But anyway, once they merged, basketball, I think one of the things the ABA did, basketball was still pretty much a Northeast game. I mean, when you watched a game here, as I told you, even into the 70s, you watched the Celtics, you watched the Lakers, you watched the Knicks.
Right.
But ABA had some teams down here. The Carolina Cougars, matter of fact, was our team here. Carolina Cougars were what they call a regional team now. They didn't really play just in one arena. They played in Charlotte some. They played in Fayetteville some. They even played in Wilmington some. They kind of moved around and kind of grew basketball's audience. Now, the South had a huge college basketball audience because of the success of Kentucky, of North Carolina, of Kansas, which a lot of people consider a southern area. But those college basketball was king down here. So the NBA never made any inroads or even tried to. But with the ABA having a team in Atlanta, not the Hawks, I'm sorry, a team in Atlanta, team in Carolina, it started moving the NBA down here. And as a result, we wound up with the Atlanta Hawks. And so the NBA, now we know they're all over, Florida, Texas, everywhere else. But up until that ABA expansion, the NBA was really a Northeast Midwest thing.
Okay.
And so I think there's another kind of twist in the game. But what the ABA brought was tremendous athletes, and I think marketing was more of an NBA or an ABA trick. I think some of the ABA stunts that they pulled early were very much more geared toward getting an audience.
The ABA was sort of their MO was to get a TV audience. They did things. They used the multicolored ball, and there were a lot of things that were geared towards getting people to watch, which had a big effect on how basketball changed, particularly like shortly after the merger and then into the Bird Magic era, where basketball really started to take off. A lot of those things came from the ABA, just embracing dunks, embracing fast breaks, embracing just having this commitment to let's create a product that people want to watch.
Well, I can tell you a personal story here that has to do with basketball. I remember getting a basketball for my birthday from my mom and dad, and it was a regular old brown basketball, and I was crushed.
There you go.
So for Christmas, my brother gets me the red, white, and blue ABA game.
Exactly.
Basketball.
There you go.
So I love that basketball. I mean, the color of it, the way it looked when it was spinning through the air. So you're right. That was all marketing. That was intended toward building the TV audience, toward building the fan base. And I think the NBA may have learned some lessons from the ABA promoters.
Oh, most definitely. They learned when they integrated, when the merger happened. They learned a lot of lessons that they carried forward into the '80s that would go on to change the game to what we know it is today.
So, I guess probably want to move on into the '70s. Was a really good NBA era in my opinion. That's when I grew up watching basketball.
I think a lot of basketball purists might disagree with you. But
I know, but you're a victim of your circumstance.
True.
Or a product of your circumstance. So I love '70s basketball.
like how many All-Star games would Dave Cowens make today? You know, just would he be the best player in the game in your opinion because you grew up in the '70s?
No, absolutely not. But every time I played in the backyard, I was John Havlicek.
John Havlicek, there you go.
Loved him. Probably another one who wouldn't make a whole lot of All-Star games.
I don't know, Havlicek. Anyway, Hondo was he was like the prototypical three. He invented what we know the three is today. But anyway, not the point.
Right.
I think one of the problems in the '70s, before we jump into the '80s, I think one of the problems in the '70s is another one of those outside of the game things. Drugs, particularly cocaine, became a really big deal among NBA players. Just a bunch of guys who had a lot of money and not a lot of things to do besides play basketball. And cocaine became a recreational drug. And so I think a lot of the 70s, particularly into the late 70s after the merger, a lot of people consider 76, 77, or no, 75, 76, which was the season before the merger, to be the worst season in NBA history. Guys were out of shape. They didn't care. And a lot of it had to do with being spread too thin in two leagues. There wasn't enough talent to hold up the number of teams that were playing, but also that recreational drug use had become such an epidemic in the league.
Well, let me once again say I love '70s basketball, but you are correct. There was a huge problem. That collective bargaining, that coup that Russell and Chamberlain staged in the '63 All-Star Game, TV rights, better athletes turning toward the NBA. By the late '60s, there were huge contracts. Now, not what we consider huge today, but huge
at the time. Yeah,
huge contracts. That money became available. You also had teams playing in bigger markets. It's kind of hard to get in trouble here in Rosman at night, but it's not that difficult to get in trouble in New York at night. And I think you had kids who came from backgrounds that may not have had a lot of money. Some of them were from the countryside and they'd never seen a big city, and all of a sudden they got a pocket full of money. So you wound up, as you said, with the drugs. I think another thing in the '70s was fights. Everybody remembers I hope most of your listeners remember the Rudy Tomjanovich story where Kermit Washington and Rudy Tomjanovich had a fight, and
Kermit Washington crushed his face.
Oh, and not only that, when he hit the floor, it crushed his skull. He was in intensive care for 21 days.
Yeah,
and that sort of back to my perceptions of basketball, that sort of made purist and even casual fans turned off toward the game a little bit because the game seemed to be getting out of hand with the drugs, with the stories of Chamberlain sleeping with thousands and thousands of women, with the fights. Seemed like the game was kind of out of control. And I think that sort of caused basketball to maybe lose a little popularity. I still loved it. I still watched every Sunday, but I was an 8-year-old kid with a happy smile on my face.
You didn't know about all the things going on outside of the game.
But when you look back through history, I know that most purist, most casual observers had a dim view of basketball in the late '70s,
which all sort of changed going forward into the '80s now.
Well, and I think the advent of there was a national title basketball game in the NCAA between Michigan State and Indiana State.
79 national title.
79 national title, and the two players that emerged from that as stars on their team, they'd been all season, but the two players in the national spotlight were Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. and both were first-round picks. And that was probably the turn toward I guess, what you really would call the golden age of basketball. Very shortly after that, you had Jordan in the league. You had just a ton of – I mean, that draft that brought in Bird, if I'm not mistaken, several other Hall of Fame players came into that draft. So you got a lot of personality back in the game. Magic Johnson was just a presence, if you know what I'm saying. He was smiling all the time.
Had that million-watt smile.
Right. He was all about the NBA. He was all about the game. He didn't get in trouble. He was a good model citizen. The same for Larry Bird. Now, Larry Bird was a competitor.
He had a 0-watt smile.
Right, but he was good for the game. So when you got that rivalry moving from the NCAA to the NBA, I think you got a lot more fans from college interested in the NBA game.
Because of what had happened in the NCAA title with those two guys, and you think that carried over? A lot of people just said, "Oh, I like these guys."
Right? Yeah, and I think that a lot of NCAA fans didn't like the NBA. I don't think, and maybe some still don't, but I think that's what has carried, at least in the '80s. That's what carried the game over. You had Jordan come out of that '82 title game with just tremendous coverage. Everybody's talking about what a star this kid is. Then he goes to the NBA. So the whole state of North Carolina starts watching pro basketball.
Uh-huh.
North Carolina was a huge college fan base. But all of a sudden, their superstar, their legacy player, the greatest player to ever come through Carolina, and, of course, Worthy and a couple others off that team go to the NBA. So all of a sudden, the whole state of North Carolina is watching the NBA. By the late 80s, what does North Carolina have? Or 90s? They have the Charlotte Hornets.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the expansion continued, and I think it's based on a lot on the quality of players that came out of college in the late 70s into the 80s. That's what brought the game back.
Okay. And on top of that, I want to throw the one more thing that we talked about earlier. The evolution of cable television is a big part of that. That there were more than 4 networks on, and all of a sudden you could watch basketball 3 or 4 times a week, and you got to see Bird, and you got to see Magic, and you got to see Isaiah Thomas and the Bad Boy Pistons, and so there was just more accessibility to the game. And
not only that, one of the things I think gets overlooked sometimes is ESPN's 24-hour news coverage of sports. You got to have something to talk about for 24 hours, so all of a sudden leagues like the NBA, the NFL, the major leagues, they're getting a lot more coverage. So I think that also played into the NBA's success. ESPN and that golden age of basketball kind of blended, and so ESPN was able to promote the game of basketball, maybe not intentionally, but they were able to promote the game of basketball.
Just put more eyes on the TV set.
Right. So, and one more thing that we failed to mention was another big change in the game was in the 1979 season, I believe, is when they added the three-point line, which will come into the X's and O's moving into the 90s and 2000s. But it was actually implemented in the 70s, and strangely enough, scoring goes down after that happens.
Yeah, the three-point line, and I mentioned this to you last night when we were talking, the three-point line was something. It seems like every iteration of the rules, when you have the lane widening with George Meekin, when you have the offensive goaltending with Russell, took immediate effect in the game. These other rule changes, you could see, you could quantify how well these rules worked or how they changed the game. The three-point line seems like something that took like 25 years for us to understand the value of, because guys just didn't shoot. I think that there was a stat last year, maybe 2 years ago, that Steph Curry had attempted more three-pointers than the entire league did in the 80-81 season. His playoffs were more than all the teams in the playoffs in the 80-81 season, which was like the first year.
I think if you take away the three-point line, I think that part of that's – this is just an opinion on my part, but part of that's easy to explain because the game – with widening of the lane and things like that, the game had become an attack-the-basket kind of game, certainly with the run and gun of the 60s. So you didn't have a lot of shooters. That wasn't a skill necessarily that you didn't need somebody to shoot from the parking lot. So you didn't have a lot of players who had that ability. And that could possibly explain why it took so long to take effect. One day somebody woke up and said, if we shoot out here, we get 3 points versus 2. Maybe we need to find some guys who can shoot from out here. So that skill had to develop in the amateur ranks and the college ranks to finally get into the NBA.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true. I know that one of the big reasons for the three-point line was two-up offense. They wanted more spacing, just to
Right.
go along to what we're talking about, being able
Right.
to use more of the court, because a lot of the court didn't get used
Right.
in the old days. That the corners were not very common. You know, besides those short little corner jumpers, there wasn't a lot of use for the width of the court, and so that they wanted to create more spacing in terms of more players being wider across the court with the three-point line.
And I know what you see and I know we've talked about this in our past, and you can see it in video games when you have those legendary teams. The mid-range jump shot was a very, very powerful tool and was used a lot in the 50s and into the 60s, even later. But as I said, you didn't have that long-range gunner, and that came about when you think about people like Pete Maravich and George Gervin. They were the kind of guys who brought about the three-point line.
Yeah.
And as that skill began to grow, then the teams utilized the three-point line better. But you're right. For the first dozen years it was in the league, nobody really knew what to do with it. They just kept playing, or they dribbled over it and went on down and set up a half-court game.
Right.
So, but I think back to the golden era, as we were talking about, those personalities came into the league. Magic and Bird in a very short time turned their two teams around, which interestingly enough for the Lakers and the Celtics, which were the teams that had come out of that Chamberlain-Russell era. So a lot of older NBA fans are interested in this renewed rivalry. A lot of newer fans were interested in the NCAA players coming into the league. So it was just a good time for the game to grow.
Kind of a perfect storm.
It was.
And not to disparage or anything, but there's also a racial element to all that there was a white great player and a black great player, and they were both on teams, and that played into it as well. I mean, sort of negatively, but you know, it is getting eyes on the screen, and it's something that you have to address and say, like, okay, well, this was part of what happened in the 80s. And
right. And I think one more thing that happened in the 80s was, as you said a little while ago, the ABA they learned a lesson from the ABA, and marketing just took off. I mean, it took off. I remember when I was a kid seeing Celtics shirts, seeing Lakers shirts. Never really seen that kind of stuff before. You know, you might have seen a Celtics T-shirt if you went to Boston, but now here's kids out in the hillsides of North Carolina wearing Celtics shirts, wearing Lakers shirts, watching the Celtics and the Lakers, singing the NBA theme song. You know, you hear them humming the NBA theme song walking down the hall at school. The NBA took off with marketing in the 80s as well. So that, I think, as you said, the perfect storm. Lots of things came into play, but that's when the NBA really became successful as far as becoming a household name. Michael Jordan was a household name like no other. We'll get into him, I'm sure, in a minute. But Jordan was one of those transcendent athletes, along with Muhammad Ali and Babe Ruth, that everybody knew. My dad couldn't stand basketball, couldn't stand sports, but he knew Michael Jordan.
And we will continue with part 2 of this podcast on Thursday. We will go from Michael Jordan into the 2000s, explore some of the great teams of the 2000s, talk about the 2004 Olympics. So a lot more to come. Make sure to tune in and listen then. Until then, subscribe to us on SoundCloud, subscribe to us on YouTube. Make sure you're catching all the latest And One Analytics podcasts. Reading the blog, andoneanalytics.blogspot.com. Following us on Twitter, twitter.com/and1analytics. Follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/and1analytics. And thanks for listening. It's always a pleasure to do this, and it's always a pleasure to know that people are out there listening to me talk about basketball for an hour. So until Thursday, I'm your host, Alex West. Have a good evening.